is the federal state planning.
Federal, and where, what tab are we in?
You are in tab,
Are we still in tab 5?
Yeah.
Federal, is this another sheet? Federal state plan.
okay. So just as a reminder,
You've got a smart, it's like the PDF from you. I don't know why you can't find that.
Yeah. Robust. We just talked about robust.
are you getting a big echo? Okay, good. So just as a reminder, my goal here is not to give you all of the details because that's not helpful. It is only to alert you to some key areas where you may want to be looking for additional input from the consultant, or as we get into thoughts about what the structure should be, where you see opportunities for alignment with already existing requirements or some potential problems if we try new things. So the key issues to be listening for, just in this more abbreviated overview, is to understand the very robust planning requirements. Focus in a little bit on some of the areas where there are required descriptions of alignment. So in describing alignment, the degree of specificity, there's a high degree of specificity that the partners have to, or the state, the board has to identify, but it can be much more. You know, so if we decided that in our state planning process, right now, for example, the state board is going through another strategic planning process. At some point, those systems need to marry a little bit, and we could add any other additional planning elements to the federal state plan so that we're all on the same page and other entities in the state of Vermont can point to us. I'd like you to look at the flexibility or listen for the flexibility in including the non-WIO activities, which just kind of reemphasize the point I just made. The opportunity to align federal programs. And by federal programs, I mean the one-stop partners, the 18 programs, and the time and effort required for this and other planning processes. So those are the things I'm hoping you will listen for. Before I go to the federal state plan piece, I'll let you know that in your booklets, I think it's number 2. No, it might be right behind right behind number 1. I printed out, rather than including the entire state plan, which is 300 pages long, you have this one document that is this year's as of July 1. It's right in the beginning after number 1. It is what the state board and the state and the governor has adopted as the vision, goals, assessment, read Oversight, and strategies for workforce development in the state of Vermont. I'm not going to go over these with you.
Where is that?
So number tab 1.
Tab 1.
Yep.
Takes like.
The reason I wanted to make sure you also had a physical copy of this is because
Oh, right.
if you were to read it, you might see a lot of things that please you. I will also admit that just because it's on paper
Doesn't mean it's real.
doesn't mean that we are living up to everything that we have said we're going to do in the next 40 years yet.
So, indulge me for getting a little bit into the weeds. How does State Workforce Development Board function in creating this document?
Perfect.
And how does the State Workforce Board assess the plan and how it's working throughout that 4-year period?
Excellent question. The answers are in 2 different documents here, so I'm just going to answer them off and not refer you to a piece of paper. One of the key responsibilities of the State Workforce Development Board is developing the plan. The plan, the document behind your piece of paper is about 80 pages of what those requirements are. The programs have significant responsibility for putting the program pieces there. theoretically, the board is convening all of the core programs, those 6, partners that I talked about, and anyone else, to establish the vision, goals, assessments. The way that it has functioned is that, in this case, Tori and Abby provided a lot of administrative support for the actual compiling of the plan for all these pieces, which takes hundreds of hours from us as state agencies. And then they support Adam and your executive committee in creating or revising the vision, goals, and looking over the strategies. Before the plan is submitted, it is approved by the State Workforce Development Board through whatever mechanism they choose, as a full board vote or as the executive committee vote. And it serves as the governor's description to the federal government of how all of the plans that are incorporated in it will deliver the federal dollars. Does that answer your question?
So in reality, the process that we have at the State Workforce Development Board, is it the full board that you walk through a higher level? I mean, you're not gonna walk through, but is there a discussion on the board level of the plan?
This past one was not as robust. The previous version was very robust. Ellen was a real leader in helping bring people together and really chew through the material.
Mhm.
So I feel that the board, through that process, understood what we're doing, made decisions about what we're doing, prioritized. And then this update is really just an update of that.
Well, and COVID happened, right?
Yeah.
And so like, I really fell off the radar, as like everybody else did, because of the timing of everything. Sarah had to get it to the finish line.
The federal government contemplates a much more engaged role of the board leading the planning process than even with the time before. I think even that was just cursory. Like, you tackled some sections of it, and the core agencies, we came together to create how we're going to implement the goals. So they kind of set the goals, and then we said, all right, now we'll take the section about these specific strategies and bullet the detail of how we are going to, for example, develop and coordinate shared professional development opportunities. I think this is a huge opportunity for us to bring together planning. And you'll see as I kind of walk through this WIOA state plan, that there's a bigger opportunity here to look at massive planning efforts of other partner organizations. So I'm not prepared to speak specifically to Perkins 5, but Pat may remember Jay Ramsey, when he was at the Agency of Education, had to put together a similar voluminous document that describes our use of Perkins 5 funding. And it involves substantially the same stakeholders. It all starts with employers. What are the economic demands, and how are our CTE systems responding to that? So I remember sitting at his table, he came to my table, and one of the opportunities, I think, in terms of governance that we have here is this plan, the TANF state plan, the RESEA state plan. There are many, every single one of these programs require a state plan. If the board or another authority were able to commit some subject matter expertise to being able to develop those plans in tandem. So people were having conversations one time about what are the priority industries, what are the training, how do we connect? We have to speak to how do we connect with higher ed, or post-secondary, CTE, and degree-bearing programs. That happens in Perkins also. So one opportunity as you're looking at this is that the WIOA state planning process provides an opportunity for many other programs listed at the bottom of this document to combine planning processes and develop how they are going to administer their funds, implement their programs. Right here, all of these. TANF, SNAP, trade, jobs for veterans, UI programs, which is RESEA, CSEP, Community Service Development Block Grant and Second Chance Act programs, we could use the WIOA state plan process and check all of those boxes for all the other programs if we decided that we were small enough to be able to do that.
Well, particularly when you look at, Jay was going out as part of the comprehensive local needs assessment to really get out and talk around the state about what the workforce needs were at the precise time. The RDCs were going out and doing the exact same thing.
Yep.
And I said to Jay, why are you not piggybacking? Well, we have very specific questions we need to ask.
Yeah.
Well, roll them all up into one. I think that needs assessment as a minimum needs to be a coordination, because we're all asking the same employers, the same questions, and they hate that. And so if we can have one conference, and that's where I think the board could have some potential to really influence that and go to all these agencies and say, okay, what are those specific needs you have for your plan?
Yep.
That we can build into these inquiries, the surveys, whatever the case might be, and stop hitting these businesses upside the head 6 or 7 times in a year.
And that process may take more than a year to kind of come together to really understand, because they are complicated planning structures, but the questions are such that it's not impossible. And if any state could do it, I would say Vermont could do it.
Sure, right.
And then we won't have this confusion over and over about, well, in WIOA, we planned, let's just say, industry recognized credential and increasing the credential rate. But in this other program, we've prioritized enrollment in CTE in 7th grade, or being on a track to support, not enrollment, but being on a track to explore.
Yeah, pushing
not
it, which is what we've been doing.
They're at odds at times in our state planning processes, and our partners come to the table with different visions of where we should be focused. And all of these programs, I will tell you, participating in their planning process, the guiding star in all of this is what are the employer's needs?
Right.
And what we don't have in the state of Vermont is a SEDS report. I know why. I know it's a complete chaotic document, but in absence of that, we have to keep going and asking the employers and speculating about what are the priority industries in the state? What have we decided to prioritize? If we can combine all of that and invite ACCD to help take the lift of creating that report, and the state workforce board could be the ship that sort of guides how all that comes together every 4 years and then updates, sort of on a regular basis. That is a fantastic use of, I think, that board.
So we need to identify 2 needs. We need to identify the business needs, but we also need to identify the audience
Yes.
that we're trying to
Service
serve,
needs.
which is, and how we get
Yes.
that. I mean, at least the businesses we know are easier to identify and go to.
Yep.
Identifying our audience and the people who need us, who may or may not even know
Yeah.
that they need us.
So that's in the state plan, it asks us.
What document are you on? That I know you've done this and I know it's
Yeah.
here and I'm just feeling like,
Oh, the federal,
are you on this
Right.
federal state plan? Okay.
You got
Yeah. I think it's like,
And so, I'll say that back in 17 or 18, whenever we changed from WIA to WIOA and redid the statute,
Yeah.
that exactly the vision that we had
yes.
was that the state board would be, even though it's a huge board, that it would be broken down into different committees that could help
Right.
provide this planning that's done. And we need to
Yeah.
make sure that people that are, especially the business community that's on the board, want to be there and
Yeah.
want to participate. But if we have those people that want to be there, want to participate, we're not using them,
Right,
they have better things to do.
that's right.
and this is a specific task that they could dig into.
But it does take subject matter
Yeah.
expertise. So I would say that while you were right in that structure, what we lacked was a dedicated resource with the skill set to be able to say, this is complex. These are all volunteer members. And so I think when you look at different boards that are paid and they come on with some level of expertise to say, I'm going to dig in and understand what I'm supposed to produce, we're gonna need to support the state board in a way that they can do that. And then wouldn't it be nice if they could also help in coordinating all the other plans? But at the very least, when you did that, the Department of Labor had, the board was more aligned on, I'll just say this, was more aligned under the Department of Labor. Now it's aligned differently.
Yeah.
And I think there's a disconnect with understanding how in the plan, you do need to know about all of the programs, not just VDOLs, but you need to understand AOEs and bulk rehabs also.
And what we're aspiring to is that the AOE would have confidence in the state board's collection of data that would say, oh, that'll suffice for my
Yeah.
data too.
Right.
We would love to pay you to,
Yeah.
Here's X dollars to save us 3X.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's better for everybody.
Right.
In Act 189 or H 919, I can't believe I remember that, of 2017-18, it was our data workforce development
Yeah.
board bill.
Yes.
And there were some directives. We did a lot of the board may. So the board may consider regional structures and come up and recommend some things. The board may participate in some coordinated planning processes. But I think what was missing in that was the actual structure behind just saying, yes, you have the authority to go and do that. But it was like, here's what that needs to look like, and nobody else can be doing that work. So as important as it is to set the table, I think you have to signal to all the other partners which tables aren't going to be like served dinner. Because otherwise, as a party goer, you're sitting at, as to Pat's point, like you're sitting at all those tables and you never know which one is actually the surprise birthday party for you. Like, where's the real action going to happen?
Well, and it may require some professional assistance
Yeah.
on the data collection part to make sure you're getting everything everybody needs and that we're collecting that, but it just, I think it's gotta be doable. And I think if that were a request from the board out to these various agencies, I think they would find that to be a welcome conversation to have.
Sure.
It's great. Somebody's gonna deal with this data collection, awesome. And, and if it does require a consultant, sure, can you throw a couple of bucks in? I can see that as a potential, but
Well, to build on that, do we have the resources with the State Workforce Development Board to actually do this needs assessment? I mean, could the State Workforce Development Board subcontract the business needs and the audience needs? Could we pay for that?
No, not today.
Not with the money no, it's like 280. But Mike and Dustin can speak to the budgeting part, but there's just a very small,
Nothing.
yeah. The Department of Labor gets money. There's
It
Dustin.
pays Abby's salary.
Yeah, right, but like for the board work, there's no
There's no money,
additional money. There's
Yeah.
the staffing of it.
but your money, just since we begin to spend all the money pieces too, what's federal, what's state? Your money is all federal,
State.
or is it all state?
Dustin?
Yeah,
don't-
so.
Go ahead,
I mean,
Dustin.
Mike can cover me if I'm wrong. The $280,000 is all state money. It's an allocation that basically covers, there are two positions that are attached to State Workforce Development Board. There's the executive director's position, and then there's an administrative position, right? So that appropriation covers those salaries and benefits, which, as we know, state government benefits are, salary plus about 35%. But it also,
52%.
huh?
52% is the budgeting number. Salary plus 52% is what we have to budget for benefits and all of
Right.
that. High.
So the other thing to remember is that the state workforce development, all of the operational needs, right? So when we were having, 75 person in-person meetings at the Capitol Plaza at $7,200 a clip, all of the mileage, all of the workshop stuff, that all comes out of that too. And I just want to chime in because I think that the question of contracting out the business needs, or, whether or not a 75 person board can be chopped up into meaningful subgroups to do the work, this just comes back to the, again, speaking on behalf of myself as a former executive director, this just comes back to two things. One, is the board size reasonable? I would say no. And not just because it's a battleship, but because the value to the business owner to participate in these conversations doesn't exist in a meaningful way to put their time in. It just doesn't. In other states, the boards are they're more nimble and they act more like an, for lack of a better example, like a governor's economic advisor committee, where they actually put forward policy recommendations as a part of the policy process. And to be honest, the size and function of the board, it's impossible to do that. It would be impossible to do that with this setup. So if my suggestion from the start would always be, if you want better engagement from the business side, you need to create an environment where they feel that they're being valued. And because there's so much federal administrative work that comes along with the State Workforce Development Board, they end up we have some great business members, but we've also lost some great business members because they just feel that it's not worth their time because they're not being involved in the conversations that it end up making meaningful change, right? I mean,
Right.
if you look at somebody who serves on the the Board of Education, which is a much smaller, more intimate group that has some actual power, people enjoy serving on those boards and they see the value of those appointments. I've thought from probably the 18 months after I got there that it's a tough appointment because not everybody sees the value in the time.
I think from a budget perspective, Dustin covered that. I think what we see in other states is either boards that serve in a voluntary capacity as providing guidance, oversight, recommendations. What we also see are boards that are actually and their own entity and serve with full-time staff. And it's the staff that are not just providing the executive director level work, but actual staff performing WIOA work. So again, that may be something where we look at how other states are structured and can decide what is best for Vermont. Right now, the funding that's in the department's budget covers the salaries. It has covered board costs, like meeting costs, and if there are funds left over at the end of the year, because it all depends on whether they're charging to a specific line or not, who's in that role, what is the current salary of the executive director and the assistant in that role. So whenever there's available funds, we've funded other special projects under the board as they come available.
And we point to those projects as our way of saying, this is how the board is complying with this role, of engaging. So the regional workforce summits were funded by the Workforce Development Board funds. And that was a contract. We contracted out. Some of you were on the RFP review committee. But when the board is supposed to convene people together and get input into the system, when we answered to the federal government, we said this is one of the ways that the board did that. The last point I want to make on I think I've covered at least the key points. Again, this is like 80,000 foot level, not even 50,000 foot level. But the one really important point I want to make sure you understand is that this work that the board is responsible for and would need support, not just of board members, but really of staff who have reach over into other agencies and can talk to and bring together the stakeholders needed to really shape a meaningful plan. That staff, that need is separate from the one-stop operator. Remember, the one-stop operator, which is a different, my proposal to this group is to consider using the one-stop operator who will coordinate service delivery. They are prevented in statute. I don't know about whether or not you can waive this, but they're prevented in statute from also being the same entity that does the state planning, because that's really reserved for the board and for the business to lead the voice of what the state plan needs to look like. So in a governance structure, consider that those are two different needs that can't be combined if there is, if that's going to happen. And those two should work next to each other. They just can't be doing the same thing. So that's the last point I wanted to make around that.
We can't combine the state plan and the one-stop operator.
Correct. The state planning has to be separate from the work that's done. I'm going to pull this right up here. The work of the one-stop operator. So here in the one-stop operator, it very specifically says the one-stop operator contracted out, procured by the board, may not convene stakeholders to assist in the development of the state plan. They may not prepare and submit the state plan or be responsible for the oversight of itself, meaning there needs to be monitoring. So that's just important because we've talked about two really important oversight needs. And in the federal structure, they have to be sort of separate things. The board has to have a way to convene that doesn't put the work on the one-stop operator, whether that's contracted or it's their own staff. Are you ready to move to single versus multiple workforce development areas? This is also shorter, like the federal plan, not as complicated, but has come up a couple of times, and I thought we'd do a little bit of a dive into this. Okay. The purpose of a local area. So the federal government in WIOA and in the workforce system acknowledges that different parts of some states are structurally different. They have different economic needs. They have different labor market challenges, et cetera. A local area, which is the same as a region, for the purposes of this conversation, an area and a region are interchangeable. Vermont is a single region state. When a governor and the State Workforce Development Board create multiple areas, they would do that knowing that that area becomes a jurisdiction to administer all of the workforce development activities. It's very tightly connected to a very specific source of funds, which is the adult dislocated worker and youth funds. Those are funds that on the next little piece is like the funding, but that's Title I money that comes to the Department of Labor. They're very specific in saying, like, how do we provide individualized career and training funds to the community at large? And you can either do it as a state, I think there's 8 single region states in the country, or you can do it as an area. So really, when you talk about an area, you're talking about the administration of services. Once you've decided that the services are such that you need to separate the state out, that there's such different needs in job seekers and employers in Bennington and Brattleboro as they are in Newport or St. Johnsbury, if we've made that determination, along with it comes a waterfall of responsibilities, including different oversight structures, different policy and administrative structures, different fiscal structures, et cetera. So the purpose of a local area is to administer the workforce development activities. The governor is the one who designates local areas for a state. However, the governor, when we first came into WIOA, the first documents that I think Governor Shumlin had to submit said, yep, we're good. We're a single region state. There's a lot of administrative writing about what can you do if you made the wrong decision and you want to break out into local areas. So I thought it would be interesting for you to see what would have to happen if we decide that we wanted to have multiple local areas. The first is that the state board needs to make the recommendation. And then they have to find that, among other things, the governor would tell them. So first, the governor would have to create some policies and procedures to designate a local area. It goes to the board to decide what criteria or whether or not different areas of the state meet the criteria that the governor has set. That criteria needs to consider local labor market areas, common economic development areas, and whether or not federal and non-federal resources are administered in that area differently. So I can see you're all glazing over. I'm going to bring it back up to 80,000 feet. So the point here is that there is a process to create 2 areas. It would require the governor making some policies and procedures about what are you going to do? Like what are your, why are these areas so different? You know, justify why we need 2 of these or more. And then the governor would go and he would, he or she would make that decision. On an ongoing basis.
So within that, so if it was decided that we would go into two regions and stuff
Yeah.
like, does that mean that we get more federal funding?
No. Nope,
So we'd have to make do with what we had
exactly.
and expand it at the same time.
Exactly. Yep, exactly.
It might
So
simplify.
we're dividing.
Too, instead of.
Yes.
Are you gonna talk about the different boards that then have?
Yes, exactly. So once that happens, the requirements for continued designation, this is really key. Each area would have to be responsible for performance of the programs. So you have 2 entities, 2 organizations, let's just say we're two regions, who are delivering services. They're tracking those services. They're doing the quarterly reports, the annual reports, et cetera. They're administering the fiscal systems because there's very complicated fiscal alignment and fiscal functions that go along with these programs because they give money out, you know, for training costs, for support services, et cetera. And here's the key. They have to meet those regional planning requirements, which requires a local board. And all of these duties right here of the local board that currently the State Workforce Development Board assumes in the state of Vermont. So the local board would have to do the local planning,
So the
2 state planning processes.
very quick thing here is
Yeah.
you go to multiple regions, you're gonna end up with 3 separate boards.
Yeah.
You have to have your state board,
Yeah,
and then each local area has to have a separate board.
Yeah.
So you're gonna go from 1 board to 3.
And
And
you
so
have-
those 2 separate boards, do they answer to the state workforce board?
In some respects, yes.
yeah, they would answer, but they all have to develop the state plan separately. Give it to the State Workforce Development Board because only one state plan.
I was gonna say,
It's-
how do they reinterpret
The
the state?
state board would have to incorporate those 2 into one document.
Yeah,
But then each of those would also be able to bill state agencies. And now you have multiple.
yes,
state-
Your funding pie does not get bigger, and you have a lot
Yes.
more expenses that go. with it.
yes.
Seems like overkill.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, it sounds like we're just dividing up the pie.
So
Well,
I think
Yeah.
I'm not going to go into all, this is just scrolling through this. You can see that's all the stuff that comes off of the state board's plate mostly and goes onto local board's plates.
I have to admit, I'm a little confused. We already have designated labor market areas, right? Who designates those? Because those are already in effect.
I don't know, you know,
Who administers
I was,
those?
when I was putting this together, over the last couple of days, I was thinking that too. I was like, shoot, I should reach out to Matt and ask how that works.
That's who it
Commissioner
is, Sarah.
Dustin,
Yeah,
you know?
it's Bureau of Labor and Statistics through census. That's who does it, right? So
okay.
the LMAs that we have, I don't know if they'll change actually since they did the last census, but that's all USDOL, Bureau of Labor and Statistics, that designates the LMAs. And it's basically based on, you know, where most people in specific regions are employed. So if you think about, I live in the Burlington, South Burlington metropolitan LMA, but that extends as far north as Swanton and as far south as south of Middlebury, right? And honestly, into some of Lamoille County, it's the biggest one that we have. But if they try to cluster, you know, where people live and work, and try to put guardrails around them so that when you're looking at regional data, you know, somebody who lives in Franklin County, you could say, okay, there's X amount of jobs in Franklin County and X amount of workers in Franklin County, but in reality, 40% of our workforce drives south to Chittenden County every day, right? So they try to figure out what the actual geographic region is outside of the political geography that we as legislators sometimes like to pigeonhole ourselves into.
And I have no idea how economic development areas are. I don't know if that's like a similar process, but I imagine that has something to do with studies.
GDP and GRP. probably.
Go ahead, yeah.
It just does, I mean, there are states with multiple boards and they do compete with each other often. And it does seem where they have competing interests.
Yeah,
Because you might have different economies and we have different economies around the state, but we're small enough that we could accommodate that within a plan than going ahead and building additional districts that
Yeah.
exactly as you all have opined is just splitting up a limited pie.
Yeah.
More ways, funding more infrastructure,
Yep.
duplicate effort, we're too small. So, I mean, New Hampshire has one, right?
They have one.
Yeah,
Maine has two. The other ones are Delaware has one, South Dakota, I think North Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, Montana.
again, rural,
Montana
big
has
geography,
one.
but not huge populations, right? Yes.
Yeah. So I'm glad we sort of walked through a little bit of this and glad we didn't have to go down to the 25,000 foot level. Because at least you know that's there. We kind of had this conversation. I think previously what I heard is that there's some interest in tailoring the way we deliver workforce services through our one-stop system according to different regional needs. And
yes,
I think
as
what I-
opposed to setting up a bunch of local areas.
yeah,
I definitely think that because otherwise you're into multiple boards and multiple pie splitting. And I think we want as much coordinated and single stream as possible.
and since
And
we're,
resources aligned under one tent, even if it's, yes.
yeah, most of the programs that are one-stop partners administer statewide programs. So I've spoken quite a bit with CSEP, the Senior Community Service Employment Program, operated by Pat Elmer, as you may know. They run their program in many regions in other states. And one thing that they have experienced is that when you're running a program and you work across different workforce areas, the boards have different criteria for what needs to be in your one-stop MOU, because they each need an MOU, they each need an infrastructure funding agreement, they each need oversight and monitoring. And so as a program, you're designing your service delivery structure and your coordination in two different areas. So I can't imagine what it would be like for me with my programs, and in addition, any other program, to have to try to figure out, like, that board is going to go monitor us according to this criteria. So the Brattleboro office may need to do this, but the Barry office is going to have to be situated this way because this local board has a different set of priorities and criteria. Okay. We don't need to talk about this anymore unless you want to,
I think, maybe-
or at least you have enough to know what to ask for.
or to not go down that route.
Well, and I think through the process that we've created with the RFP, that we will hear something from the consultant on whether or not this is something we should actually look at.
Yeah. And as Mike noted earlier, I think he's still in. So as Mike noted earlier, other states have like Michigan has many areas. One of their areas has created a structure to support refugees. So when we hear from the consultant, one of the things we'll have to keep our ears open for is those opportunities where it's been done in other states, but understanding that it's been done in an area and not on a statewide basis, and thinking about how that applies to us in terms of our governance structure.
I'm just gonna add real quick, I mean, I think it's important to recognize though, like, just because you're having this conversation about not wanting to split up into potential areas, like, as part of your federal regulation requirements. I don't think there's anything that prohibits the board from, in your state plan, identifying that there are different needs in different regions. And then if you're
Right.
organizing and coordinating your workforce system, it may look a little different over here than it does over here. Like, there's nothing, I think, in the law that's gonna prohibit you from doing that.
Right.
I think it's just when you actually go and check the formal box that says we're gonna create different areas, now all of a sudden you have all these other requirements. So I just like, there's nothing stopping us as a state, if you're a single area state, from having different regional priorities and setting up a different system.
Yeah.
Or prioritizing different aspects of a system.
Yeah.
In different areas, convening different partners in different areas of the state, et cetera.
Yeah.
You have your core, and then you can work outside of that core. It's kind of, I mean, it's like CCB. They have all their core that they teach, but in different areas, they may teach something else,
Right.
depending on what the regions need.
Yeah. As you're aware, I know it's separate from this, and I'm glad it is. There's an ongoing, RFP and study that AOE is leading on creating a statewide adult CTE process. That will make it much easier for us when we're doing our planning to have an entity that isn't like dealing with 17 different centers.
I was just thinking about the parallels to the adult
Education.
education, learning and literacy,
Yep.
for regions and how that's
Yep.
posed challenges recently.
It has, and so has, I think the unification of the transformation of the state college system is going to be so great, because like, when I would work with these Vermont Tech before, I would work with Pat and Maureen, and then I would work with Tiffany and with Joyce. And now I feel like when I'm having conversations with Pat and we're talking about how do we coordinate her area of influence and understanding, while probably growing with each coming day,
Right.
is like, it's just so much easier to be
Well,
able to
it's-
say like, okay, how do we big level?
It's that one-stop phenomenon with the state colleges now, too.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You guys want to talk funding now? Okay, so this is the final of the 4 sheets
Okay.
in that same section. I think it was section 5 for you guys.
Well,
And it only has 2 kind of pieces here that I think are key for you to understand kind of coming into the.
I don't have this sheet. Oh, it's called One Stop American Job Center System. I don't have a funding piece. But I remember.
Right at the end.
It's okay, well, I'll get one.
So, this is, don't need to read this. Here's all the one-stop partners again. What we tried to do this year with the MOU, it's also included in your MOU, example of the MOU, is we identified what for program year 2022, which starts for most of us, July 1 of 2022. So it's not like the state system where it's a little bit behind.
It's a year behind.
Pretty much, yep. And all of these programs, even some of them here, are on different schedules. So some of them here, my fiscal year starts for some of the programs on October 1. Some of them are July 1. There's one's April 1. So in general, though, we try to at least put down to paper, because many times legislators say, how much money is in this system? Well, here's a piece, here's some information for the federal piece. I don't have my reach onto all of the state pots, but that could be something that the State Workforce Development Board monitors, and part of their staff responsibilities are.
They
So-
don't currently.
No,
So I recall a
Yeah.
number that was, and maybe it's not some of the required participants, but of federal WIOA dollars coming into the state north of like 50
80,000?
million, 60 million.
yes. So
That wasn't just
80.
yellow, was it?
it was, so that's the thing.
It
In the
was more.
WIOA state plan, when we did this, when I did the first iteration of this, Mary Brannigan just coordinated the second iteration. This doesn't have a total on it, but there were different criteria given to programs to supply numbers. So for example, TANF this time supplied a number $2,367,524. in a previous plan, when we had the whole budget, it was, I think, $40,000,
3,000.
or sorry, 40 million. That's because they included their entire source of federal funds,
Yeah.
including payments that go out to participants.
Yeah.
So we left it because there's such apples and oranges and what this money can be used for. We left it up to every program to decide whether they were going to put their whole federal award or just the part that is dedicated to employment and training. And you can see here, there are a couple that are missing. Also notably in the previous one, Youth Build gets discretionary grants. They don't always get money. You have to apply for it. I think the previous one, it was a time when they had 1.1 million. The other one that was pretty noticeable, so they did total up to $80 million. It's not 80 million in WIOA funds because WIOA technically are only the Title 1, 2, 3, and 4 funds, but it's the funding that is contemplated by WIOA to create the federal workforce system. I think the total here is probably closer to 40 million.
Sorry, Sarah. There was
Yeah.
Also that document that bounced around the legislature, because I remember of everybody's training dollars
Yes.
across all of state government.
Yes.
And that was in the 50s-ish plus, but it
Yeah.
included like Community High School of Vermont.
Yes.
It included, direct payments. And so
Yep.
when it came down to your discretionary monies, that which you could actually play with,
Yeah.
it wasn't a big pot.
Well, since Cameron's here, I'll just point to the fact that UI does not really help the workforce. Like, they don't have money to provide to
Right.
job seekers except for through the benefit program. So Cameron can speak to this, but if he wasn't here, I would say, consider that administrative costs and some amount of benefit. I don't know.
No, and I
Like-
put that number in there because we were developing the MOU
Yeah.
and it was trying to figure out what's the cost share going to be, et cetera. So we put, that's what our administrative funding was for the prior program here.
Mhm.
Quick side note was cut 10% 8 months into the program.
Mhm.
Thanks USDOL, but no, like, we're not gonna put in there the amount of benefits that we actually put out. I mean, because I
That's
think
not-
that artificially inflates.
But that's separately funded rather than you're administering it, right?
Our administrative costs come from USDOL, and that's what they give us. The reason I put that there is if we're gonna have a conversation about funds that are available for infrastructure of a workforce system, that's what we have, right? We can't use benefit dollars to help cover the cost of infrastructure
Paper
costs.
telephone
So
lines and.
But
we
could you-
wouldn't, for example, put the amount of benefits that we pay out.
But could you divert any piece of that 7.9 million? I mean, or don't you need that to support your infrastructure?
We could, but
It would be.
I would argue the money we get from USDOL is inadequate to even run.
Precisely. I mean, so I'm not sure I would include that as
Right,
flex
right.
funding or
Right,
anything.
yeah, and so that's why, as I did that too.
What do you put?
Right, well, yeah. Well, and,
Yeah.
UI is UI, it's not training, it's.
I've never understood why they put.
UI as part of the required.
Partner. I mean, I get the concept is you go into a one-stop, you should, you're a job seeker and you need assistance getting unemployment benefits, you should be able to get it. I totally understand that concept, but I've never understood why they put
Required.
it with the other training programs, because we're not a training program.
It's, that you're a potential conduit to disseminate information about training, but that's about it.
Well, if you're just starting from the beginning, it's a source of customers.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but not
their
to
training. That's-
say, oh, great,
Separate.
geez, Cameron, you got 8 million, we'll take 5 of that. And they're like, great, I'll be able to get benefits out to, 1/3 of the number of people I can do right now, it's like, that's not.
Well, Pat, if this looks familiar to you, we didn't get the number by the time this was published back in July, but again, Perkins funding comes to the state of Vermont. The post-secondary used to go part to CCD, part to VTC.
Still does.
It still does, and it goes for things like training CTE instructors.
Mhm.
Does
Does
So
that,
that is required, like they have to pay, or the Agency of Education would have to pay a proportional share as required infrastructure funding So there is a misalignment
Yeah.
with what the feds have selected as being the required one-stop partners and the funding versus what we see as being, the system we want to integrate. And so my purpose is to show you the money, because when we sat at that table to negotiate the MOU, everyone's giving each other, in a polite way, the stink eye and saying, well, my programs are not like applicable to you at all. And, Paul Dragon, the CBOEO, is like, how do I fit in here? I'm like, we have federal funding.
Sarah,
Right.
another example, the one right above the UI, it's RESEA, so towards the bottom, Employment Services and Eligibility Assessment. It's got $885,000 there. None of that money actually goes to an individual for training. That is just the administrative dollars to cover staff for that program. Now, those staff, what they do is they take unemployed individuals, they bring them in, they try to give them direct, intimate support in getting reemployment. But it just becomes challenging, when you're looking at this document, because not all those dollars are available to actually give people for training.
So most of these dollars represented here are administered just to fund the program, as opposed to funding the programs, as opposed to the money that actually goes to the
Participants.
I'd say it could be half and half, like, I don't know what you guys put for your WIOA stuff, if that's actually.
Yeah, some of ours are support, like,
or-
the refugees, we've been like, let's use our federal dollars to support driver's licenses and housing payments and computer tablets and things like that. We can use money for haircuts and clothes and bicycles. And that's mixed in with UI, and there's the terms of, and so it doesn't make a lot of sense, but you should understand when we're looking at this governance structure, that there are some things that are a little quirky about it.
I'd be the contrarian on this and say
Yeah.
that, the intent is to, if an agency or department has an $8 million budget and is trying to improve the overall system, if it could take 5% or 10%, invest in something that's going to provide a greater return because they are investing in it and now are a stakeholder and true partner in it, they're going to watch that money and say, no, I want a return on that investment. That's the idea.
Yeah,
When you drop it into an existing funding, I don't think it works because everyone's trying to protect it. If you're able to start that way, I think it'd be more effective.
And I would say, I totally agree with you from the UI piece. The goal for the UI program, and UI participants, is to get them reemployed. So if we're paying into a system that is effectively getting them employed very quickly, then in theory, it saves on our need for administrative staff to support a UI program. So I 100% agree. It does become very difficult.
Budgets.
And, I think the commissioner's point earlier, should continue to come up all the time. It's like, well, what's the system that you want? Where's the end? What's the end goal? And then let's figure out how we get there. Because, right now, if you just try to chip away at stuff today, I don't know where we're going. And so, yes, it is very difficult with the budget that I have if I don't know what the actual investment is for and what's the return for me. Sarah, I was just thinking one point, I don't know if it makes sense, like moving forward when we develop this, if it makes sense to identify for these programs, which ones are admin dollars versus which ones are actual dollars available for training.
I agree. We did start to work with the contractor, because the board, if you don't recall it, the board contracted, or we on behalf of the board contracted with someone to put this together. Admin dollars have different definitions for you and for me, even though we're the same department, and get money from USDOL. And especially when you then look at TANF, like they have different definitions for administrative dollars. So that would be something, if interested, the feds would say, well, state, you can come up with your definition and how you're going to track it, and then you go ahead and do that. But I agree with you, but it just became another one of those.
Yep.
Avalanche. Before I move from, go ahead.
And even if there are flexible dollars, a lot of these folks have gotten in habits to spend it in a certain way,
It
like.
has to be right. You
Yeah,
have to
there
be
have to
right.
be some, that
Yeah.
buy into the plan, recognition and planning. Like Perkins, we use a fair amount of that funding to provide advising and counseling services to students, because we get a chunk of money from TRIO, which are for first gen and certain income eligibility. And then there's everybody else. And so we put a little bit of that Perkins money in there. We put some into funding equipment to keep certain labs well-equipped? And so it's all over the map. So if you came and said, well, guess what? We're gonna take, 75,000 your per month. No, you're not, because you gotta find some other way to make it up. So it's,
But was that part of the, was that federal policy intent was to break up these old funding systems?
I think what it was, it is exactly what you said. It was just like, I kind of think my world with Act 46, it's like, okay, get everyone in the room and then surface all the issues and find those areas where you can, where the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. That was the intent. The feds also don't expect perfection, which is why they say it's up to you guys to negotiate it. So if you say, as a state, we say, and we all agree that Perkins 5 or UI contributes nothing to this, and we all agree to it, all we have to do is show them an agreement. It doesn't have to be equitable or equal.
So this money conversation and the complexity of where it's sourced and how it can be used does raise the question for me going forward. And our timing of this committee is a little at odds with the governor's recommend and the budget being put together and the legislative process. So I'm just thinking we should be identifying maybe something to encourage the governors to put some money aside to actually help finance whatever work is that we're going to be recommending. And that we will provide, that will become clearer as the process goes through the legislature. But it strikes me that right now I'm just going to put while we're having a money conversation, that we're going to need to put some money aside to actually realize whatever we're wanting to recommend.
Or some transition, because
And transition.
you may not be ready to stand up something for July 1 with any transformation.
We may not, but we're gonna need money to do it, whatever, and so Kendall, we should begin to have that. I think we have to have that conversation.
These two.
What, and
Oh, those two,
Yeah, I'm out of that conversation.
or those three, and that person, right. It's hard, Mike, we can't see you, so as much as you're in the room, I have it's,
not in the room.
there you are. Hi.
And not personal.
I would be there if I could, but
You can't.
You all
We're
help.
delighted. We're quite frankly, we're delighted you're not there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
fair enough.
But, right.
And same with you, Abby. But I raised that question anyway, so I think we should start thinking about what we want to put aside for us.
We'll have to look at the timeline, because the timeline of the RFP doesn't have the final report coming to us till July 1.
Right.
So this would then be like a next session conversation where we could then have
But
the recommendation.
yeah, but
And-
is there, may there be a need for us? And we won't know until
Yeah,
we get the RFP back,
right.
if we spent all the money or not.
well,
But if not,
Yeah.
then, we may need to use some of
Carry
those
forward.
dollars to do other things.
well, we've already identified something that we want. We've already identified something that may not be able to be taken care of with this particular group that's doing this RFP. We've already identified the need to get the data on our audience. And how do we do that? That's sort of an independent.
That's in it, isn't it?
Well, I would say
No,
that
I don't
the
think so.
audit, well, it's in it for the RFP for them to do stakeholders. I would say that the system repairs that we're contemplating in our new system are not part of this. You need to create the new governance structure, and then they say, okay, we want to do a survey so that we can adjust. I think we have to move like the game a little bit, and then say, okay, now that we have the people who are accountable for the responsiveness to customers or understanding whether it's meeting their needs, then they say.
We need to
some- we
identify
some
who our
funding
customers
to
are.
do, yeah, to do.
Well, I still think we're gonna need to build into whatever you guys are gonna recommend for the continuance of this work. We're gonna need to recommend.
And it can be small for fiscal 24, like as a placeholder that can get worked on during the session to fine tune it. And then with the, but it creates a precedent, like, okay, we're gonna start making some state level investments in
Right.
this. And it might be that in fiscal 24, it's not a huge need, maybe it's 500,000. Just to get something going with the restructure of the governance stuff, as a, for instance, that then becomes,
Why don't we put a pin in this until we're going
Yeah,
through the
no,
articles?
that was my point.
We'll say, yeah,
My point was to,
right,
while we're having the money conversation, oh,
Right.
yeah.
right.
Okay, last part.
But has everyone is going through, you know, these numbers and sharing them on, you know, what their allocation may or may not be. I think if they're not doing it, they should be looking at what is the value, what's the return on investment for me?
Mhm.
If I share, you know, 5% or 10% of these dollars,
Yeah,
what am I getting back for that? So I think
Yeah.
even Cam just sitting here thinking about it a little bit said, well, you know, we may
Right.
not need as many people, as much staff as we do now, because we're getting people, they're coming in on unemployment and going right back out again. And so they're saving money. And how does that work with everybody else too? It may be that they're providing administrative, that's their administrative dollars, but how can that save them money? So we talked about, you know, streamlining the ability to gather data so that we're not getting data, we're not using 7 different people talking to the same people to get the same data.
Mhm.
And so those are ways that everybody, I think, that have provided these numbers should be thinking about that.
Yep. So with that, in your binders and section 2, the very last one is a complicated thing that you don't have to read, but you need to know it exists. It is the federal guidance on the infrastructure funding of the one-stop system. You'll see that it is really stinking complicated, and
If you didn't already.
it's more complicated when you have many regions. But my takeaway from this is that there's so much responsibility given to the governor in determining caps and deciding which programs contribute which amounts, that it indicates to me that USDOL, when they came out with this and they had their rulemaking process and they went through other partners, that HHS and the DOE and other USDA and other organizations that fund these programs said, we decide how those states use our money. And they had to come to some agreement and saying, well, they're part of the workforce system, but they're like, hey, other agency, USDOL, you can't tell us what to do. So the compromise, which is how it manifests itself in the rules and the regulations, is that the governor gets to be the final one to say, this program is excluded from contributing because I see the bigger picture and the states need to use this funding. I see, so it would require a lot of work from the administration to be able to navigate that. That is an authority very carefully provided or reserved for the governor and not at all for the board. So the board can't go in, nor can the legislature. Well, maybe the legislature could through a different mechanism, but the board can't go in and require those partners to do that. It is a negotiated process that the governor has the final say. If they can't come to an agreement with the support and the resources of the board saying, here's a way you might save money by contributing, and no one buys it, the governor he's the backstop. He provides guidance to say, in the event of non-agreement in an infrastructure funding agreement or an MOU, here's how you shall or shall not contribute. So this guidance is important for you to know. What I put in here is the opportunity, but there's a backstory to it, which is there's some protections and some caveats to all of it.
Sarah, can you explain the difference between the board and the operator in that?
Yes, operator doesn't have anything to do with the negotiating of the MOU. Once the service, they may help with providing information and context about how things are when the partners and the board come in and say, how's service delivery going? How are we going to meet these objectives and meet this goal according to the state plan? They come in after, and the board says, we've got our MOU, We've designed how service is going to be delivered. We've designed how costs are going to be allocated. Now we're going to contract with someone, the one-stop operator, to do the work as the operator, as the coordinator. So,
The operator does not determine the bill.
correct. Yep. They do the administrative work, for example, like now, right now, because we don't have a one-stop operator, Abby will be supporting, going to our fiscal, we're the fiscal agent for all of this, the Department of Labor. So she'll go and work with the fiscal unit at the Department of Labor to generate some bills. And she'll mail them out and arrange for the accounting for their proportional costs. But the one-stop operator didn't decide. Only the partners decide whether or not they're going to sign. You know, you'll see on that, Pat Moulton has signed at the end of that because VTC is a voluntary partner.
Saw a human hand here. Yes.
So the last part of all of this is just specific to WIOA and VDOL, because I wanted to be transparent about the money that we get through Title I programs that we currently use to support some of these statewide activities. So first, I'll just go through.
So is this?
No, so this is separate and it's in.
This is what you just went through.
Yes, correct. Yep, I copied and pasted that because that's the whole one-stop system federal funds. So this little deep dive is, I wanted to show you, bird's eye view of all the federal dollars and then take a 30,000 foot view at very specifically the WIOA Title I dollars.
And where is this?
So see right here. Oh, so it's on a piece of paper that you apparently don't have, but everyone else did.
Okay. Well, that's not unusual.
I thought we put all five into all of yours, but somehow there's a set moving. So this number right
You
here,
just have to listen.
2163 doesn't match exactly because I think these were, we had some new numbers.
21.
But 2163 roughly is 2146, right? So what I'm going to go through right now in the VDOL budget is this, and this. Title I and Title III.
So actually, those numbers are right here on the thing you just walked through.
Yes, very close.
Did you include the migrant in there? No.
No, because Pat Stone gets a separate allocation and there are some other, so these are, it's a little confusing in this respect. So just
But it's here.
Job Corps, Youth Build, and Migrant and Seasonal Farm Worker programs are discretionary grants that USDOL gives to other organizations, not the Department of Labor. We could perhaps go after some of those. Historically, there are other community organizations that administer those dollars through their own organization. So we don't. And, but those are authorized through Title I. These are formula funds. Ours are formula funds. These are discretionary grants. And
And-
sometimes get them, sometimes don't.
The Trump administration eliminated youth build for a few years.
For a few years, yeah.
They did.
Yeah,
Well,
so like Tom Longstreth and others were scrambling. to
Right.
find
Yeah.
Ways to keep
Yeah.
them.
Okay, so Department of Labor.
If they're the formula based ones, that we're probably getting a small statement.
We are getting a small statement. So,
Would be
Wow.
nice if that was more though.
I know,
Yeah.
I'm most sad when I see like Texas compared to
Yeah.
Vermont,
know.
the amount of money we're getting in our small
Yeah.
state minimum.
I won't pull, I have a chart I was looking at.
No, it's just this.
Yeah.
And I know Senator Leahy and others have tried to get those numbers moved up. And I think Jim Jeffords had some success, if that tells you how long ago that was. So, yeah.
Yeah, we met with Senator Sanders' staff about a month ago and made some recommendations.
Which they accepted.
They received our recommendations. They received the information and the feedback. There was also a lot of like,
Got it.
okay, so these are the big pots of money, and there's a very small amount that's called the statewide reserve. It's the governor's statewide reserve. I'm gonna be like super clear about that. Earlier I said the Department of Labor has a role in administering the system on behalf of the governor. So the governor receives all of the WIOA dollars and then his agencies administer it. We receive 21 million, roughly 21 million in adult dollars, 22 million,
2.1.
sorry, 2.1.
2.1
Today. 2.1 million in adults, 2.2 million in youth, 1 million in dislocated worker, and 2.1 in the Wagner Pizer, that's the basic career services. So you are aware, these dollars come through my division at the Department of Labor. There are 76 positions currently associated. So when you think about this money, not all 76 are funded by all of this, but I would say roughly at least 65 are funded with federal dollars. And it was a topic of conversation about,
Right,
you know, so
right.
this also funds administration. The ASA Bloomer building in Rutland, just our rent over a course of a year is $144,000. So we're talking about infrastructure costs. And Allison, you know, keeping open our space in the White River Junction office. Those are some pretty hefty bills, and that chips away pretty darn quick. Because in that is staff costs, it's infrastructure for keeping open physical spaces. So that's just one of 12 spaces that we're maintaining. It's also the training costs. It's the bicycles for refugees, the fees to support someone getting their license expunged or their record expunged, a lot of other support services that eliminate barriers to employment. These programs in the federal regs for Title I, you'll see I have 85% here. That's because at the very beginning, we take 15% off the top for what is called the statewide activities or the governor's reserve. That number is represented right here. I'm going to come to what we use that for in a minute, because you'll see that we are currently using it and kind of maxed out with using it on a lot of important things. Other states, 15% of like $80 million.
Yeah, it's significant
Real money.
money.
That's real money. That can fund a state board. That can fund projects. That can fund so many other things that right now we don't have the ability to do. So as I've talked this whole day about the opportunity of the federal program, this is where you see the funding. The funding isn't there to make sense of all of the opportunity we've spoken about. So let me first just say, you've got adult dislocated worker and Wagner, those three funds. So the Department of Labor holds back in the governor's reserve $817,000 for statewide activities. Unless you want me to say more about these core programs, I'm just going to jump right to what those statewide activities are, because I think there's going to be some aha moments with things that we need to do to administer the one-stop system, WIOA, the state board, and all of that, and where we could be doing better, what currently the Department of, there's some gray area with like, the Department of Labor does this, but under WIOA, the Workforce Development Board has the authority to convene employer partners, to develop the one-stop, but you're like, where's the money? Well, if you wanted to be really mean, you could say, oh, it's right there. But I want to show you what that money is being used for, to say like, we can't really get rid of those things either. So we're at the
Well,
home
until we
stretch.
bring state money into this, we're never going to have enough money.
Right, so there, I think is some governance conversation around like,
Right.
what is the right way to blend and braid? And I would say,
And braid. I've never.
Rated funding, that's a new thing.
it's the new thing.
Blend and braid though, the braiding part is just.
I learned that in early childhood.
Can we do some feathering too and maybe add bangs?
Meeting,
I know, it's interesting.
What did he say?
feathering and add bangs.
Feathering in there, yeah.
Adding a feather.
Feathering our bed. That has a sort of bad connotation.
No, feathering your hair, like
Oh,
Farrah
your
Fawcett.
hair. I don't know how you do feathering your hair.
Well, since
I
we're
know how to feather
braiding,
a bed.
right, you know, that would be great. It would all go together.
Wow.
So there are required, and this is also in section 3 in the regs, there's a more expansive list, but there are required statewide activities. And they include performance reporting, key among all of them, and program oversight. We have to do a lot of monitoring of our own programs, but so does the state board. And so if you are to start introducing state funds and say, we want the state board to do X, Y, Z, then the other important piece of that is to say, okay, let's not duplicate federal and state dollars. If you bring in the Department of Labor, the administration and that and say, okay, the board is now going to use this funding for this purpose, that's where we say, okay, now we have some free resources. Let's make sure they're doing what we need to do so we can check the box and point to that, the state dollars. But these free resources could be used for something else. So I'm pointing out what this statewide dollars currently fund: non-discrimination awareness and compliance. At the very end of your booklet, you will find a pretty hefty set of regulations around non-discrimination and equal opportunity. They require positions, the EEO, the Equal Employment Opportunity Officer, and they require a whole ton of awareness and inclusiveness in our workforce development system. Commissioner Harrington is, I think, still the chair, although you'll be coming off. I don't want to break your big news, so you can come in after me, Mike, if you feel it's necessary. But the commissioner was the chair or co-chair of NASWA, the National Association of State Workforce Agencies non-discrimination work group, this EOO work group, and has over the last 6 months looked to me and to Cameron and to a bunch of us over at the department to say, there's no real funding except for some of this statewide activity funding to do all of the oversight that we currently are supposed to be doing. But how can we still try to meet the letter of the law and all those regulations? This is a really important and will continue to be an important part of what the board oversees and what we as agencies all have to do. So I want to highlight that because I know the commissioner is looking at perhaps using some of that funding that my division is currently using, but it would be reallocated to really be more intentional about non-discrimination awareness and compliance. And I'll stop there.
Well, I want to dive in a little bit there
Yeah.
to like make it real for you. That means. So for example, being able to translate materials into different languages so we can provide it to, individuals who are being resettled here. And there's a lot of actually real on the ground stuff that can help support program participants that, we want to try to invest in with some of those dollars and some UI dollars, et cetera. So, when we talk about, there's all this non-discrimination oversight compliance that we need to do, it's really more of how do we ensure that we're using that to impact actual individuals. On the ground. So it's check the box to make sure we have that. So we don't have a circumstance where we can have a claim where we're discriminating against somebody, but you actually get into the nuts and bolts of what that means. It's there to try to help participants. So
I think as a state, we've been relatively lucky because of our size. So when someone does have a concern or a complaint regarding to EO or non-discrimination, we've been able to handle it effectively so far, but I think it's only a matter of time. And being on that committee, recognizing the amount of resources that other states are putting behind equal opportunity, non-discrimination compliance, we've got a long ways to go. Actually, under parts of WIOA, our department is actually in charge of oversight of compliance under EO and non-discrimination for all WIOA programs across the entire state, not just within the Department of Labor. And if you also take the word of the Civil Rights Center, the CRC, and the DOJ, which presented at the conference this past week, it really is any other, what they look at is if your department receives WIOA funds, right? So not just the Department of Labor, but, other departments across state government, any other functions being performed under that entity also must come into compliance with the CRC and equal opportunity compliance law. So we are one of the only states, if not the only state, that doesn't have, except for maybe the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, that don't have a dedicated EO officer. So right now I function as the EO officer for the state under this WIOA requirement. But we really need to have a dedicated individual that's owning this at the appropriate level, because they have to do everything from monitoring statewide programs under WIOA to investigating complaints of discrimination and noncompliance. And they also, to Cameron's point, have to be making sure that as a department and as a state, we're in compliance with the equal opportunity law, which includes things like proper accessibility. So are our programs and vital records translatable and translated in many different into the top languages, and are different programs accessible to the fullest extent possible? So we've got a lot of work to do there, and that's probably a top risk we've identified, if not managed. So that is one area where we've prioritized.
So, Michael, I'm again, duplication of effort. That strikes me as Beth Fastigi's world. Why don't we have that person embedded in HR?
So they do handle things under the Equal Opportunity Act, like things, reasonable accommodations for employees. So this is not about equal opportunity for our employees. This is about how are we following the Equal Opportunity Act and non-discrimination policies for how we serve clients and constituents, right? So this is.
But I mean, sorry, just to play devil's advocate on that. You could make that argument with absolutely every area of state government, because that's what we do. We serve constituents, every one of them, every department.
So in many states, this EO role actually sits at the executive level and oversees all of EO for the entire state, right? So we are a little different in that function. And because other programs actually have other EO compliance officers. So again, we haven't needed to have it, but essentially the way the law reads is it needs to be an executive, almost cabinet level, right? So that's why we've designated the Commissioner of Labor in that role to serve as the cabinet level, because it actually reports to the governor. But in many other states, it's an entire EO office with, a dozen or more employees that are ensuring EO compliance and non-discrimination across the entire state. We're a little different in that respect, but we do need to make up some ground that's been lost over the years. And that's not new, but it is new in terms of how it interplays with WIOA.
And an opportunity for governance discussion would be, when this first came about, I was identified as the Equal Employment Opportunity Officer, went and did the training, and then was like, But they, the feds want you to be a direct report to the governor. So our general counsel and I met with some of the other general counsels for other agencies and said, if AOE has to do civil rights compliance, transportation has to do it, could we maybe start considering under the office of the governor, a place where all of us can have subject matter experts who do monitoring, and because the EOO and the non-discrimination regs don't change from department to department. They're the federal regs.
Right, exactly.
So, but they extend, because of WIOA, they extend all the way to, if I give, I'll just use Cathedral Square in Burlington, just because they're kind of a new grantee, right? We give them a grant. If we were to use federal dollars, we'd have to go in and find that they are all in compliance with everything. There's a massage school, I forget where, I think it's actually in the southern part of the state. They want to be on the eligible training provider list.
Right.
Well, if they're located on the second floor and they can't accommodate, then technically we can't let federal WIOA dollars go to provide that training, even though they're only training one participant every 5 years. So it has a pretty extensive reach into the private sector because of WIOA.
But to your point from earlier, Sarah, when you're a state that receives $80 million in WIOA funds and 15% of that is used for these other programs, that's a big deal, right? When we're talking about how do we use $800,000, that doesn't get us very far with all the ancillary programs that aren't covered under WIOA.
So the last four.
We got 4 minutes.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I thought we were at 12:30. Okay,
Go to Ken, vote.
good. So this is the last part.
12:30?
Yeah, but we did.
And he's saying that he wants to stay on to wrap this up in the next
Yeah.
5 minutes. and we'll move on.
Yep.
Oh my God, it's already noon.
So
How did that happen?
Because you're having so much fun.
It has been a really informative.
Yeah.
It's been great. It's, my head is
Spinning.
filling.
So another point I wanted to push out, because I know legislators have been attuned to this. One of the other things at the statewide level, the Department of Labor is assigned to do and works to do. We're about to do it because some of this funding is with our new CRM and our information system. We're replacing Vermont JobLink. I can't name the vendor yet because we're still in contracting, but we're making really significant progress. And by July 1, we will have a new entire digital system for case management, job boards, apprenticeships, and internship. We'll have the functionality. We've been bringing in Advanced Vermont and Tom Cheney, whatever. We'll be able to
Good.
have like a training platform. Will it be perfect on July 1? No, but it'll be pretty close. And we want to be, one of the big responsibilities is just in the consumer focus, consumer choice system set up through WIOA, is that we'll be able to disseminate information about a variety of things. So that's another statewide activity. I'm noting that because we had some conversations last year about saying, if you're funding another entity with state dollars, and we already have to make some of these investments because they are required statewide activities, we had some frustration with like 2 parallel systems and there's only room in the state for 1 shop. Maybe you will disagree, but should it be us? Should it be somebody else? Should this be structured differently? I at least wanted you to be aware that some of that money, whether it's staff time or infrastructure, goes into that. Tom and I have clearly had this conversation, as you are all aware. The other is this last one, conducting evaluations to promote continuous improvement research and to test innovative services, strategies, and higher level of performance and outcomes. That may sound like monitoring in the State Workforce Development Board, but there's a very prescriptive definition for conducting evaluations. This is not customer satisfaction surveys. This is like contracting with St. Mike's or a professional entity to come in and say, how is this program working? How can you do it better? We have not done this since I've been on board, but did do it back in 2016. We are right to have to spend some of that $800,000 contracting out with an entity to evaluate our programs and give us some feedback over the next year. So that's another use of the money. I won't go through the rest of these because I know we're up against time, but these are the final ones. Carrying out the activities of the state plan, the monitoring and oversight. Again, there's some monitoring and oversight that the state board can and should be doing more of. The way that these funds would be braided together might be, we contribute some amount for the oversight of and the monitoring of some of our Title I programs. But if there is an overarching monitoring of the system and the one-stop system, then maybe some state funds would apply that same monitoring practice so that you can compare apples to apples and understanding the health and well-being of the whole system. Obviously, operating a fiscal management and accountability system is so key. So some of that funding goes to support our fiscal office and the structures there. That's a sampling of how some of that statewide funding is used. I did not include a part of the statute, part of the rule where there are required statewide activities and then there are allowed statewide activities. If there is a decision to braid and blend funding and some of the things that come off our table in terms of required, we can point to someone else doing it funded elsewhere. There's a whole menu of other really exciting things that we could also be using the federal dollars for. That's just a topic for a different day when we start thinking about who's the right person to be paying for which activity.
Quick, so this is our required statewide activities of DOL or of the operator?
Of this, no, not the operator, of the system. So with think about it as the governor. So the governor gets Title I money, and he is required to both deliver the system, which he does through staff at VL and whatever for Title I. And then that 15% set aside are things that we as a state, as the recipients of the money, are responsible for doing. That money currently goes to VDOL to try to meet some of those requirements. So it's about $800,000. It pays my salary. It pays, you know, in terms of planning and administering, pays for the performance reporting, some of the system that displays information now. So it does not go to the operator and it does not go to the board. It goes right now to labor. I'm noting that there's some overlap there because I think in some states they use some of their statewide money to fund activities of the board. And they point to what the board has done as ways to come into compliance with some of that. And we may have an opportunity there, but I'm not saying that we have available dollars there to necessarily support more non-state work. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's it.
But that also could be the money for the assessment.
Yes, at what cost though? So, you know, if you were to say to the commissioner, you know, for the evaluation, you mean?
Yeah, for everything we've just been talking about. How are we
Yes.
doing? How well are we doing? What more do we need to do? Who are we serving?
Yes, we could conduct evaluations to promote continuous improvement. And we would do that. I wouldn't say that we have just $100,000 kicking around for that. So as we think about having.
Yeah, but if you're looking at $800,000 and what, how to use it more effectively.
Correct, perhaps. I would say, when you get under the hood with how we're using that $800,000, we're already stretched.
Yeah. Got it.
You know, when other states have, you know, $17 million to do all these things, and we have
Well,
800,000.
15% of their budgets.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How much of it do you use for rapid response?
Oh, good point. Yeah, so rapid response is a required activity. 20% is required to be used for rapid response. So yes.
So remind me what rapid response is.
Rapid response are activities that connect the UI system and the workforce, the unemployment and reemployment systems together.
So like the
Business
businesses going out of
like-
business.
Oh, right. That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
That we help them connect. So this, it's staff time, and it is also, as Adam was one of the first pilot programs with this, we use a small amount of it from time to time. We're experimenting with layoff aversion funds. So it's funding that is given directly to a business or an entity, a consortium of businesses. In this case, it was BDCC. But we have to make a case that it's going to prevent layoffs. So in the case of a grant to BDCC a few years ago, we used a small amount, 8,000 of our layoff aversion funds. And Adam brought together a bunch of folks in hospitality. I think it was hospitality,
Yeah.
was it? Mount Snow and others, to do some sort of a certificate program with,
Management, to skill up frontline
Upskill.
staff to become full-time.
yeah,
But, would otherwise have lost their.
they otherwise would have lost their jobs because they were seasonal workers. And so in that way, the federal government likes to see that because then they don't end up on the unemployment roll. And so we're using money to help continue to promote continued employment.
Coffee, your donut disaster donut.
There was a rapid response team that was deployed to that, but not the training.
Right.
Donut disaster.
Now, if the donut, if coffee
And
cup,
there's food noodles. That's what I hear.
There's coming, yes.
if
I'm still missing those people though.
If Coffee Cup had come to us, and not to say that this is far too simplistic, but if they had come or the RDCs had gotten wind, hey, what they really need is $5,000 for a new piece of equipment in order to stay open and totally revolutionize their businesses.
That is where
That's the sort of stuff, like if we can make an investment with limited rapid response layoff aversion dollars, it's an allowable use of money. Many states don't use it because there's such limited funds anyway. But we've been trying to experiment with how we can use our WIOA dollars to serve our business customer a little bit more over the last few years. And this is one of the areas we've been dabbling in.
That's,
it's good.
it's all good.
Yeah.
It's just getting that intel that You need to be in there.
Yeah.
Yes, and
It's the game.
so in building that pipeline of back and forth, well, it serves us in all these areas. But we need people to be in that pipeline, communicating with those
ground.
businesses, yeah.
Yep.
All right, and that's I mean, right. I remember going to your ones, yeah, anyway. This is funny.
Fair, thank you.
So that was
Brain dump there.
Really.
that was a huge breakdown, thank you.
What is our quiz?
That's awesome.
I think next Thursday.
Yeah.
Then you and I are supposed to explain this, right?
right.
No, I'm hoping you're going to be involved with the posting on that day.
I was.
It's complicated. That's-
It's fine.
Yeah.
Or simplified version of this might be good for the board sometime, like simplified.
So another thought I had was that we have a discussion with our delegation, our federal delegation. Maybe some of their staff come to a meeting.
Oh, that's a great
and Go
idea.
over this with them,
Yeah.
now that we've absorbed it.
We've absorbed it, are we?
Well, absorb the 80,000 foot level, but we know a lot more right now than we did when we came through the door. And we know that a lot of the issues that are in there are federal issues that
Right.
we can't deal with, but they can.
No, I'm feeling better and better about our calling the question on this a little bit.
I would recommend, before you take that step, get yourselves someone other than me to walk through the waiver. Because that's where the Fed, anytime I work with the delegation, like, that's for a waiver, I'm like, it is such a complex beast, not to say it's undoable. So I don't want to give you the impression, because there are some reasons why we haven't gone after waivers, because it doesn't really, I don't think it's going to give us a return for our investment. It's just to say we got a waiver.
Yeah.
But I do think it's important for you to get a little bit more legal counsel. I don't have the bandwidth or the brain width right now to go through and learn the waiver piece as much for this group.
So
But if you had
maybe
somebody
ask
that-
David to take a look at that.
Michael, who does your waivers now?
Us, me.
Oh, you.
Yeah.
Oh, you.
Yeah, we don't really manage
Oh, I
a
see.
large
So you-
number of waivers.
There isn't somebody
Yeah.
else who does them.
Yeah, I feel like your consultant should be able to look at like what other states have done creatively for waivers and say there's some opportunity here and there, and then maybe you're even better positioned to have a conversation with us.
I think what we see more often is not a waiver that says just throw out all the federal regulations and you can do whatever you want with the bucket of money you get. But it's really key areas where there might be a current requirement that is so restrictive, it doesn't apply to your state or is preventing your state from doing work in a particular area. So you can ask for waivers that flex the requirement to allow for more opportunity in a particular program or a particular funding stream or a particular effort or activity.
The waiver in your book, I think in section 3, if you look for the one that's 679, it outlines all the state board requirements. At the end of it are all the opportunities and prohibitions with waivers. So if you really are interested in reading about it, you do have the direct source of it.
We would take our contents.
I didn't make one.
Because I was going to say, you were helping illuminate what's in each one of these sections. but
Yeah.
I didn't think there was anything that's. It's forcing us to read every section.
I know, I just wanted to get it here and put it on the table.
You did
Putting
really.
it together.
At least you have it.
So
I love it.
Yeah.
maybe I could make a copy of this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know why, I had 5 copies. I don't know why you didn't put that one.
Section 6. All right,
Okay,
so
so-
you guys thought you were done with your books, but
It's right behind the statutory.
I said my conflict, so where it was right, oh, it's right there.
Yep.
So what section did you think it was?
Very open section, you'll see our charge, and then right behind
So.
it.
Yeah, I see our
the
charge.
second- So the second thing in your binder, right up top, is a copy of the RFP, and I just handed a copy to.
The
Pat.
request for proposal. is
Yes,
right
an
there.
RFP is a request for proposal.
It's right here.
It's right on, it should be the second thing. So,
It is.
so for review, this, committee received $250,000 allocated to the agency of administration secretary to contract out for whatever support work we feel like we may need. So I'm highlighting that because the agency of administration will be the ultimate contract holder here since they're the holder of the funds and will be using state executive branch contracting policies. Just as an FYI, this RFP is currently live. It was posted last Friday. It's on the BGS, Building and General Services website where they host state RFPs. So it's there, and Sarah, you provided a great list of other organizations that we wanted to make sure to highlight this opportunity for. So BGS has pushed this out to that list. If people have other folks that you would like to make sure know of this opportunity, I would recommend you send me their contact information, and then we'll have BGS continue to push it out for us as kind of our point of contact on this.
Is that the marketing of it?
Yes, like a NGA, FYI, or,
Right.
you know, there's this opportunity out there where Vermont's looking for a contractor to do some system analysis of their workforce and recommend governance options.
And it's important that we push it out because other RFPs right now are coming back with low bidders. I mean, a lot of consultants are sort of max, so we and the greater system need to push this out to as many potential bidders as we can if we're gonna stay on our timeline.
So what you see in the RFP, I'm looking just at page 1. I'm not going to read this word for word for the task force members here. I know you guys have all probably read it. I've sent out multiple versions over the past month, so you're all probably sick of looking at it, but it's highlighting.
No, and thank you to the subcommittee for doing the bulk of this work. So we are very grateful. Mike and I are very grateful.
A couple of the key highlights from it. So just looking at the bolded language in the middle of page 1, it says specifically the contractor will review comparable state and municipal structures and provide a risk and benefit analysis on how each state's organization structure impacts the delivery of services, program performance, effectiveness in adopting, aligning, and coordinating statewide public policy changes, supports accountability and governance, and meets state identified policy outcomes. And then the contractors will provide at least 3 organizational structure scenarios that are demographically and geographically like Vermont for the SOCWED, which is our new acronym. We want to start calling ourselves the SOCWED. We love acronyms in state government, right? To consider for reorganizing our state's workforce system. I know that was a lot of words. So that whole section, I feel like packs a lot of punch. But one of the things you'll see throughout this is we are asking the contractor not to evaluate performance of specific programs. So the point of them is not to go look at like the Vermont training program or the apprenticeship program. They need to have an understanding of what programs we want to coordinate and a baseline understanding of like, their funding, who do they report to, like, what are they? They might get kind of a glimpse about, does this program turn out 3 people a year or 300, but they're not supposed to solve any specific programmatic challenges. It's just be who's going to be accountable and how we're going to organize who these programs report to get our most, leverage
Bang for the buck.
bang for the buck. Exactly. I was thinking that. So skipping to page 2, I would then highlight the last 2 paragraphs. So the contractor will support the SOCWED in understanding the current landscape, developing recommendations that build a framework for using our resources most effectively and efficiently, and how restructuring and strengthening infrastructure will improve our ability to serve employees, employers, and communities. And then kind of a reiteration of what we've been talking about today and what I just said. They will detail how Vermont compares to other states or municipal systems, because we do know that San Francisco, I'm making that up, could be something for whatever reason that we want to emulate, and they have a larger population of Vermont. Obviously, they're not demographically or geographically like us, but that's why the word municipal system is in there.
Because it could be a big municipal system.
Exactly, like.
That's all of Vermont.
Yeah, like Durham, North Carolina, I mean, could somehow have a system that we think would be great for us. So anyway, it's not intended to resolve the challenges of individual programs, but they'll have to have an understanding of that. And then so it lists out what this system includes, which we just learned about. It does say this is not, it includes this, but it's not limited to, in case we missed something, but we just spent the morning learning about the system. And then if you go to page 3, you'll see how we start getting into deliverables and a little more specificity here. So phase one of what we're asking is for them to map our current workforce governance, administration, and integration that exists now. So outline Vermont's existing workforce system, including training, education, and expansion efforts by listing relevant programs and descriptions of the roles and reporting structure for each entity involved in program administration. Pat, you had mentioned an old document that was circulating in the legislature. I'm not sure what year that was. We put something similar together back in, I think, 2017 by our chief performance officer, who was Sue Zeller, where we went through each agency and department and tried to, tried to pick out what is considered a workforce program.
Yeah.
So that now might be a little moldy. I mean, that was 2017, a lot's changed. So again, so we understand our scope of who we're talking about organizing here within our governance structure. Report on existing level of formal and informal coordination and integration across workforce programs and infrastructure to support this work. So the first one I feel is a little bit quantitative. The second one's a little bit qualitative in nature. So they will give us their perception after doing some of these stakeholder interviews and research and what they're doing, and we'll have to see what they find.
And is this across the board? So it's labor, corrections, the whole kit and caboodle?
Yep, that would be your number. So first, I think they number one, decide who's in the system, and then they go through once they have that list and figure out how much those programs are coordinating, and if they need to be coordinating, and if not, why not, and what our communication structures look like.
And they'll check that list with us, I think, right?
Yes,
And
yes,
say, like,
yes.
basically, if they're like, should we include this one or should we not? Some small something, then I guess it's this group or a subgroup of this group who works with the vendor who will say, yeah, include them, that's what we need, or no, we don't.
But
so that.
it's state and non-state actors.
Right, that's what I was just gonna say.
Critically important. I mean, one of the key things, at least for, I think, Mike and me, is we want to make sure that all workforce actors or development actors are in here, not,
So your Job Corps, your high techs, your everybody's.
Yes.
List.
yeah.
Could be,
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah.
That's what's not getting coordinated.
To the table, right. So then identify potential barriers that they're seeing based on, again, the research that they do here on effective governance, administration, and integration, and identify when participant and program level information is shared between partners. I'm going to get to the timeline in a second. I'm just going to keep outlining the deliverables, and we'll talk about when we're asking them to deliver them. Phase two is review of the state organization and delivery systems. So this is where it comes in. So now that we understand the picture of what we currently are working with in Vermont, how does that compare to other states or municipal systems where it would be appropriate to compare and contrast what's going well and what's not for us compared to others. And then recommend at least 3 models for us to consider and talk about basically the strengths and weaknesses of those models. And they would need to make sure their recommendations that they're putting forward account for and address strengthening the workforce development system for job seekers, strengthening and expanding the workforce development system for employers, and reflect how the new models would change the status of Vermont's workforce system. I'm not sure why we wrote COVID-19 recovery revisioning in there, but I do think keeping the pandemic lessons learned and our recovery generally is important. And then assuming no changes to federal and limited changes to state funding. So we could see more federal funding. I mean, Sarah just showed us how little there is. We could see more state funding, but it would be helpful to know, like, hey, if you want to make this change, you're going to need $200 million more, right, than you're currently investing, or this change, you need about $5 million. I'm making up numbers right now, but so anyway, so those are. So was there something you wanted to, you're looking at me like you want to comment?
No, I was just thinking about the current funding and other funding.
So those are the 2 main things we have asked them for. Like Sarah just said, if you just keep flipping to page 3, it's on page 3, I'll just say this in somewhere in here. We, the Sockwood, would support this contractor in their work. So if they have questions that we want this person in or out, can you help us identify a contact? We're going to do stakeholder interviews. We all want to be involved and I want to be there. They will be doing the majority of the the literal writing and organizing, but we are saying that we will be available to support them and guide them. And even though AOA holds the contract, we will ultimately be who's working with them on the most regular basis. So deliverables, we're asking for them to create a project plan. We're starting to get into timeline here, which is further articulated more clearly on page 6, but I'll go through as it's written out on page 4. So we're asking for the phase 1 report to be due February 1st. So that's what's on the ground in phase 1. So what does the system currently look like? How well are we integrated? How well are we talking? Who's in it? Who's not? Deliverable 3 would be draft recommendations for phase 2, which is what are 3 models that Vermont should consider emulating, due on April 14th, 2023. And then their final recommendations, again, on what are those 3 models. There's also in here consideration of how the size and scope of the state workforce board, which is in the statutory role of our group, the role of the commissioner of labor, et cetera, being considered in that are due to us July 1 of 2023. We, as a task force, had talked about having a much more compressed or expedited timeline, but just as a refresher, some of our further conversations over the past month were that we were very nervous about what could actually, this scope of work be done by January 15th. So obviously, we're going to miss the legislatively mandated timeline for us to have recommendations, which was January 15th, which I understand Senator and Representative, you guys were comfortable with, and you'll represent to your respective colleagues, right, during this session. So I just went through the timeline. So again, to get a little more granular, this was posted on Friday. It's on page 7 right now, where I'm highlighting under timeline in the middle. We're asking for questions about the proposal, which is part of normal state contracting RFP process. We can write in and ask questions are due next Friday, October 7th. EGS will receive those and scrub them. And when I say scrub them, they'll take off the names of who's asking the question. That way we don't have any unintended bias, conscious or subconscious, when we see who's asking questions, and they'll send the questions to us. So and if we get any next Friday, we'll receive questions that we will have to
Come together and answer.
We'll have to come together and answer. Exactly.
Yeah.
Then proposals are due 2 weeks after that on Friday, October 21st. And then between October 21st and November 4th, we as a task force will have to meet to review the bids and have vendor meetings where we can discuss how we do this, but oftentimes when people bid on state contracts, we'll have bid presentations where we invite them in for like an hour and a half to walk us through basically what they put in writing and give us a chance to ask questions. And then again, if we stay on our timeline, we would begin the contract with them on or before November 4th. And then we get back into those deliverable dates, February 1st, April 14th, and July 1st that I just outlined.
Actually, contract, we also said can begin as, can begin as early as November 1.
Yeah.
I know that the contracting process always takes longer than you think, but just keeping that in mind, knowing we'll have some support.
Yep.
That usually.
Yeah, so EGS will continue to collect the bids, post information, help us in terms of that administrative end of it. But again, it will ultimately be up to this group to do the actual review decision making. EGS is just acting as basically an intermediary to receive paper, but we'll have to come together. So I know the next phase we'll put on this is scheduling, but this does give us an idea of when we should be holding times on our calendars to meet to review bids.
So Kendall, how much is available, did you say?
$250,000.
So what happens if, for instance, it comes in at 125, 150?
That's great. We have extra money at the end of the day that
We could do that data collection.
that we could reallocate. So we need to, I'm very skeptical it's gonna come in under $250,000. I'm actually very nervous we're not gonna receive any bids we can afford for this scope of work. This is similar to the healthcare and learning governance study that was just completed for this July, and that cost at least $500,000. So I'm hopeful. So if we do, so it'd be great, right? If let's say we end up spending 150 or 200,000. there'd be $50,000 in theory of carry forward for the legislature and the governor and the budgeting process to then reallocate to other stuff and things, hopefully in this space.
One thing, I 100% agree with you. I'm concerned about still concerned, even though I'm much more at ease with the timeline. I'm concerned about the scope of work. And I will say that my preference would be that we are all on the same page with regard to the costly part about this is going to be stakeholder engagement and information collection. And it's not ever going to be perfect. We've tried this a million times, not one, but probably at least half a dozen times for the last 20 years. There will have to be some agreement, I think, with this committee about how many people do you have to ask for their viewpoint or their assessment of the system before you said we have enough information to make a governance decision, because it will be costly and repetitive. But I think we need to have that engagement process, but we'll all have to be willing to say like.
So we're, I think there's an advantage, right, is if we see their list of stakeholders and we feel like someone's missing, we can still meet with them as a group. You know what I mean? Like, even though we don't have to pay the contract or whatever their advocate fee is that they're charging us, like, we could say, we really want to hear from X, Y, Z, and we can just do it. So the other thing that I wanted, they're going to give us a report on July 1st that in theory, or hopefully we'll have 3 recommendations. We, as a group, are going to then have to look at those 3 recommendations and say, do we like these? Do we like option A, B, or C? Do we see these and, oh, these are very interesting. We want to do a hybrid of B and C. So we'll have to, I mean, it's way too early to presuppose like what we might get. They might be very strong. Like you asked for 3, but there's really only 1. And we, to fulfill our obligation, like we did give you 2 other examples, and then we might be like, yeah, we agree, and it's easy. But I just want to say I don't think July 1 is the end necessarily of our work. Fortunately, unfortunately, because then we're gonna have to come to consensus.
I don't know, July 1.
Then we're gonna have to come to consensus on which option is to be like.
And if there's additional money,
So
the action plan is the actual deliverable to the legislature. So I would say before I would not support gathering data at all in this process, because I think that's a separate process. But I would say if there is money available for another consultant to say, okay, you guys pick the design you want to go with, we'll come in and help you design the action plan for the legislature. That's how I would say that money should be spent, because I don't think it is as contemplated in this part of the RFP. But we'll see.
Right.
If we
And
can
the
get it.
action plan with like, what do we do with
Like,
this?
That's what you wrote into it, Allison.
Yeah.
You said you have to do an action plan.
I know, like how
What do we do with all this?
to operationalize the.
We need an action plan.
This sounds very similar to the legislative select committee on higher education.
Yes.
And-
There was a two
Yeah,
I haven't seen it to NCHES.
yeah, I mean, they're familiar with Vermont. They're
Yeah, and
familiar
I
with-
talked to Brian, I was like, you guys can do this stuff? It's like, we're doing something similar in Oregon, but with the higher education system. He's like, so we could probably think about whether or not workforce systems is the same work, but at least you get another.
And I found that analysis to be very thorough. And
Yeah.
Well, and hopefully they will, instead of saying, no, we're not going to fill out the RFP, we're not going to bother applying, they would say, we would do this, but this isn't enough, or we would do this, but this, we would recommend you do blah, 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 blah.
Right, you might get some of those responses.
Now, what happens if it's 275,000, the bid?
Yeah, well, then we'll have to figure that out. We'd either have to.
That's the slush fund.
Negotiate,
Okay,
we'd have to
yeah.
start again and narrow our scope of work. We could look and see what discretionary funding AOA might have, put input towards it.
There's budget adjustment,
There's-
and there's budget adjustment, and
Yeah.
we will be clear on, if they could say, this X amount gets you to phase 1.
Right, right.
And you're gonna need an additional whatever
To get
to get to phase 2. We have budget adjustment. I mean, we have.
Yeah. But again,
We have, race car winnings. I mean, we could go to all sorts of places to, find it.
what I really appreciate about this timeline of all of us here too is that it seems like we're all really interested in doing it like thoughtfully, right? And not like rushing, and like in terms of being able to extend the timeline and have this level of engagement. That way we're hopefully, well, I hope that I won't be or we won't be, but in like 10 years, right? We won't be around doing the same thing. We probably will be, but.
If they
It's like
are,
this every time.
that will be a very,
Yeah, so.
work.
Well, thank you, Kendall, for getting that.
Yeah, great work.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Kendall, that was a big piece of work.
Yes.
Particularly when you were working with some of us who weren't technically capable as you.
So we were talking about funding for the session, right? So I think we'll have to, yeah, as we're working with the contractor this fall, depending on what they can turn out in November and December, like we might have an idea if there's like, oh, hey, here's some like immediate, like low hanging fruit that you guys might want to just tackle right now that will really influence the larger question. I mean, I can see the governor, hopefully other partners here too, is most likely going to propose a hefty investment in workforce. But we'll have to be mindful that it doesn't, cart before the horse on some of this stuff. But if there are things like with
Right.
refugee resettlement, again, like, that he's gonna be talking about demographic crisis and net new workers.
Yeah.
The governor probably won't be like, oh, I have any workforce proposals this year.
Well,
So,
we know
but
that.
anyway,
But we just want to make sure that this work is financially supported going into the future.
Yes,
So that we can
yes.
actually get it across. the future.
I'm very excited too about at least our enthusiasm for putting more state dollars into VDOL.
It may require a revenue.
More power.
State dollars that may not already exist. I can pass that. No, it's just, we all have to be open, we just.
Yeah.
We're
So we have the regional workforce expansion system and some of the role, and it's a pilot and it's slowly taking shape. It's a 2-year project, but some of the roles that those staff are doing under VDOL are some of the things we've talked about today. So knowing it's a pilot, does some of that role and responsibility and the good work that may produce, does that somehow look a little differently as we go forward? But for now, because we haven't created a new system, we'll make it start to do, we'll paint the plane while we're flying it. We've built some of it, but we'll start painting.
the interior of the cabin, I know.
Yeah.
So do you want to tackle scheduling like via email, but we could use those
I
RFP
think so.
timelines are probably our most immediate
Yeah.
next meetings.
So,
Those-
Abby, do we have
those-
anyone that's in the waiting room that,
Oh, a public person with comment?
we have public comments set up for the agenda. I want to make sure that if there's anyone that wants to provide any comments, is able to do so.
We do not that I'm aware of.
I'm happy to complain about the weather, Mr. Chair.
It's above zero.
We
Doug.
can all complain.
Not
Better than
in
that.
St. Albans, it's not.
Not
I
right,
know, and
is it
tonight
raining?
it's gonna be very brisk,
Frost tonight.
Yeah.
20, they're saying.
and I'm going to the other.
Okay, so.
I know, it could be worse. Could be.
So let's stay tuned on setting a next date.
Do we want to try and do that now?
Well, I think
I
we want to wait. I think we need to see if there's any additional questions. By next Friday, then we should think about the following week to probably get together on Teams, just to have those, to go through that.
Sorry, what's next Friday?
Next Friday, 7th, is
Questions on the RFP.
when they're, if anyone is interested,
Questions
if
about
they
that.
have questions that they need to ask of us, we need to give BGS time to scrub it, and then,
Like the
Let me
13th.
ask BGS this afternoon how long it'll take it to scrub. I assume like a couple hours. It's just getting someone on Monday to sit down and do it.
well, it won't be.
Scrub it so we don't.
I think it's just like,
So probably,
For the 14th.
well, towards the end of
That
the
week,
following,
Yeah.
the following week.
which is right upon us.
Yeah,
I don't know.
We don't,
yeah, it's a really challenging time of year for some of us.
what, you have somebody running to get you out?
Yes,
I didn't know.
you do. We do. We always do.
Okay.
It's a campaign season.
Good.
Some of us are going door to door this afternoon. I mean,
I
this
do
is why
mine
I'm dressed.
I go door to door every day. Oh, no,
Yeah,
they
yeah,
come to me.
The door is. So there's no one in the waiting room?
Why don't, can we follow up on email with the?
Yeah.
Can we do a doodle
Yeah.
poll?
Yeah, so we'll,
Abby doodle polls.
once we find out that there's questions, and if there isn't, then we'll figure out another time to get together. And send out maybe some thoughts on what the next discussion would be, asking any questions.
I think that select a vendor would be our next step, right?
Probably,
Yeah, would be the next, like, at least major time commitment,
Yeah.
would be, bid meetings and
Yeah.
vendor selection discussion.
So,
And that's gonna be great.
so everybody stay tuned. We'll get back to you. Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, thank you for joining us. Pat, thank you for coming on with us. Really
Well, I'm
appreciate
gonna
it.
try to make
And
future
Pam,
meetings.
thank you for joining us. It's been very helpful to have all of you
And Ellen.
and having this discussion. Like, I hope everyone likes, this is a little different way of running a task force where, you know, we're more interactive, you're not just getting talked to, and that we're all working together and trying to understand. So I really appreciate that.
I don't want to do this again though, because I just stopped working for 4 days, 3 days.
Same.
But,
That was
thank-
really what you
Sarah,
just
thank you for putting all that together. Kendall, thank you again for the RFP and all the work. that both of you
Oh,
put
it was
into this.
huge. An RFP representative.
Really appreciate it. But I think with that, we're done, so
Yeah.
I think we can stop recording. Michael, thank you again. Dustin, thanks again. Thanks, Abby.
Thanks,
Thank you.
gang.
Bye.
Who's next week?
But-
It's next Thursday, is it in person?
Nope.